You got the wrong house." The words barely left Marcus Reed's mouth before the front door burst inward under the weight of heavy boots and shouted commands that shattered the silence of the quiet Baltimore street at 4:17 in the morning. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain-streaked windows like broken lightning, washing the small brick house in violent color while neighbors peeked through blinds up and down the block. Marcus stood frozen near the hallway in gray sweatpants and an old navy hoodie, one hand still gripping a bottle of heart medication he had been carrying to his mother's room. The sharp smell of coffee lingered in the kitchen behind him, mixing now with cold air and wet pavement drifting in through the ruined doorway. "Hands where we can see them," a voice barked. Flashlights swept across family photos, dusty bookshelves, and the faded floral couch Evelyn Reed had owned for nearly 20 years. Marcus slowly lifted his hands, calm even as his pulse hammered against his ribs. He had seen fear before, seen chaos before, but there was something different about watching armed officers flood into the home where his mother slept 20 feet away. Something colder, more personal. "Please," Marcus said carefully, his deep voice steady despite the noise around him. "My mother's sick. You're making a mistake." Officer Daniel Whitaker stepped forward first, broad-shouldered, jaw tight, rain dripping from the brim of his cap onto the hardwood floor. His flashlight landed hard on Marcus's face. "Marcus Reed," he demanded. Marcus nodded once. Whitaker exchanged a glance with another officer, the kind of look people gave each other when they already believed the story in their heads. "Thought so," Whitaker muttered. Behind Marcus, a weak voice floated from the hallway. "Marcus." Evelyn Reed stood trembling near her bedroom door in a pale blue robe, one hand pressed against the wall for balance. At 73, her movements had grown slower after the stroke last winter, but the fear in her eyes moved fast enough. She stared at the strangers inside her home and tightened her robe around herself like it could protect her from what was happening. Marcus instinctively took a step toward her. 3 officers immediately raised their voices at once. "Don't move." Marcus stopped instantly, lifting both hands again. "She just needs her medication," he said. "It's right here." But nobody looked at the pill bottle. Nobody looked at Evelyn struggling to stay upright. Whitaker kept staring at Marcus like he had already decided exactly who he was. Outside, rain tapped against the broken doorway, while distant thunder rolled low over the city. Somewhere across the street, a porch light flicked on. More neighbors were watching now. Marcus could feel it. The silence of people waiting to see another black man dragged out of his own house. Whitaker stepped closer, voice low and sharp. "Funny thing about guys like you," he said. "You always act calm right before we find what you're hiding." Marcus met his eyes without flinching. His expression never changed. "Officer," he said quietly, "if you keep going down this road, tonight is going to end very badly for you." For half a second, the room went still except for the rain. Then Whitaker laughed under his breath, cold and dismissive. "Yeah," he replied. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Marcus glanced once toward the shattered front door, then slowly back at the officer standing inside his house. "That," he said softly, "depends on whether you're here to listen or just here to destroy something." Whitaker's smile faded just slightly at the calmness in Marcus Reed's voice, but only for a second. Then the officer stepped deeper into the living room, boots crunching across broken wood from the ruined door, while 2 younger officers spread through the narrow house, shining flashlights into corners that had not changed in decades. The small place smelled faintly of cinnamon tea, old books, and rain drifting in from outside. Family photographs lined the walls beside military commendations that nobody bothered to look at closely. One frame showed Marcus in desert camouflage standing beside 3 Marines under a scorching sun. Another showed him holding a much younger Evelyn Reed in front of Johns Hopkins Hospital after her recovery therapy. But the officers moved past those details like they were invisible. "Search everything," Whitaker ordered. "Closets, bedrooms, basement. I want eyes on every inch." Evelyn flinched at the sound of drawers opening down the hallway. "Marcus," she whispered shakily, "what is happening?" Marcus turned carefully toward her without lowering his hands. "It is all right, Mama," he said softly. "Just sit down for me." Sergeant Laura Bennett finally stepped toward Evelyn, her expression tightening as she noticed the older woman's trembling hands. "Ma'am, maybe you should sit in the kitchen while we sort this out." Evelyn nodded weakly, but before she could move, A harsh voice came from the hallway. "Clear back room," one officer called out. "No weapons so far." Whitaker looked irritated by the update. He studied Marcus again, eyes narrowing like he could not accept how composed the man remained. Most people panicked under pressure. Most people raised their voices or begged questions into the air. Marcus did none of that. He simply stood there beneath the flickering hallway light, with steady eyes and quiet breathing, like someone who had learned long ago how dangerous fear could become when other people carried guns. Outside, rainwater rolled along the curb beneath flashing patrol car lights, while neighbors gathered under porches pretending not to stare. Across the street, an elderly man named Mr. Kaplan stood in slippers holding a coffee mug against his chest. He had known Marcus for 6 years. Knew the man shoveled snow for half the block every winter without being asked. Knew he drove Evelyn to dialysis twice a week in a dented black Ford pickup. None of that mattered tonight. Tonight all anyone saw were police flooding a black man's house before sunrise. Whitaker took another slow step closer. "You keep acting real confident for somebody under investigation." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Investigation for what?" "You know exactly what." "No," Marcus replied evenly. "I really do not." One of the younger officers walked back into the living room carrying a small locked metal box. "Found this under the bed." Whitaker's eyes lit with instant suspicion. "Open it." Marcus finally shifted for the first time, not toward the officers, but toward his mother. Evelyn looked exhausted now, one hand pressed against her chest while the kitchen clock ticked loudly behind her. "Officer," Marcus said quietly, "before you do anything else, my mother needs her medication in the blue cabinet beside the sink." Whitaker ignored him completely. "Open the box," he repeated. "Sir," Marcus said again, more firmly this time. "She has a heart condition." The room hesitated. Even the younger officer holding the box glanced uncertainly toward Evelyn. But Whitaker only extended his hand impatiently. "Key." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Rain hammered harder outside. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across the sleeping city. Then Marcus slowly reached into the pocket of his sweatpants and pulled out a single silver key attached to a worn leather tag. Whitaker snatched it without thanks. "You should have cooperated sooner," he muttered. Marcus watched him carefully as the officer knelt beside the coffee table and slid the key into the lock. "No," Marcus said softly, his voice almost swallowed by the storm outside. "You should have slowed down sooner." The metal lock clicked open with a sound so small it almost disappeared beneath the rain and police radios crackling through the house, but every person in the room still seemed to hear it. Officer Whitaker leaned forward immediately, his confidence hardening as he lifted the lid of the box like a man expecting victory. One of the younger officers angled a flashlight toward the contents while Sergeant Laura Bennett stepped closer from the kitchen doorway, her face unreadable beneath the cold white light washing through the broken entrance. For a brief second nobody spoke. Inside the box sat neat rows of documents, old photographs, a folded American flag sealed carefully in plastic, and a dark leather folder stamped with a gold federal seal. Whitaker frowned. "What is this?" Marcus did not answer right away. He watched Evelyn lower herself slowly into a kitchen chair, exhausted from standing. Her breathing sounded shallow now, uneven enough that Bennett finally walked over and retrieved the medication bottle from the counter herself. The older woman nodded gratefully with trembling fingers. Across the living room, Whitaker flipped open the leather folder impatiently. His eyes scanned the first page, then narrowed. "Federal credentials?" he muttered. One officer beside him shifted uncomfortably. Marcus finally spoke, calm as ever. "Told you to slow down." Whitaker ignored the comment and kept reading, but the certainty in his posture had begun to crack. Bennett crossed the room and gently took the folder from his hands. Unlike Whitaker, she actually read the details carefully. Her eyes paused on the identification photo first, then the seal, then the signature beneath it. Her expression changed almost immediately. "Daniel," she said quietly, "step back for a second." Whitaker scoffed under his breath. "You think this is real?" Marcus looked directly at him. "I think your department skipped verification because somebody got excited about a black man on the wrong street." Silence spread across the room again, thick and uncomfortable. Outside, the storm softened slightly, rainwater dripping from gutters while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. A television flickered faintly in a neighbor's window across the street, where silhouettes still watched from behind curtains. Bennett opened the credential wallet fully this time, exposing the badge clipped inside. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Marcus Reed. Her jaw tightened. Dispatch never mentioned federal involvement, she said quietly. Marcus gave a faint nod. Because there was not supposed to be local involvement. Whitaker stared at him. You expect me to believe you are FBI living in this neighborhood? The words slipped out before he could stop them, ugly in a way that made even the younger officers glance at each other uneasily. Marcus did not react with anger. That almost made it worse. He simply looked around the small living room at the worn furniture, the old curtains, the water stains near the ceiling. My mother likes this neighborhood, he said softly. And unlike some people, I do not measure human value by zip code. Bennett lowered the badge slowly, realization beginning to settle over her face piece by piece. What operation? She asked carefully. Marcus hesitated for the first time all night. His eyes drifted briefly toward the broken front door where flashing patrol lights painted the walls in red and blue shadows. Then he looked back at her. One that just got compromised. Whitaker folded his arms defensively. You still have not explained why your name came up connected to narcotics activity. Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose. Because somebody inside your department has been leaking surveillance locations for 6 months. The room froze completely. Even the police radio chatter seemed distant now. Bennett stared at him. One of the younger officers quietly lowered his flashlight. And for the first time since entering the house, Officer Daniel Whitaker no longer looked like the man in control. Officer Whitaker opened his mouth to respond. But before any words came out, a sharp voice crackled through one of the police radios clipped to an officer's shoulder. Supervisor en route. Repeat, supervisor en route. The tension inside the small house shifted instantly. Nobody moved for a second. Rainwater dripped steadily through the open doorway onto the hardwood floor while the flashing lights outside painted long shadows across Marcus Reed's face. He stood exactly where he had been since the officers burst in, calm and upright. But now there was something heavier behind his eyes. Not fear. Disappointment. Sergeant Laura Bennett closed the credential wallet carefully and handed it back to Marcus with both hands, her earlier authority replaced by caution. Agent Reed, she said quietly. If this operation involved federal oversight, local dispatch should have been notified. Marcus accepted the badge without looking at it. Local dispatch was the problem. The words landed hard. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably near the hallway while another slowly removed his gloves, suddenly unsure what kind of scene he had walked into. Evelyn Reed sat silently at the kitchen table holding her medication bottle close to her chest. The kitchen light above her buzzed faintly, throwing pale yellow light across the wrinkles in her tired face. She looked smaller now somehow, fragile beneath the weight of strangers flooding her home before dawn. Marcus glanced toward her briefly. Mama, he said softly, you all right? Evelyn nodded once, though her eyes remained fixed on the broken front door hanging crooked on its hinges. You said this work was dangerous, she whispered. I did not know dangerous looked like this. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, but did not answer. Outside, tires rolled slowly through puddles as another black police SUV pulled up to the curb. Officer Whitaker looked relieved for the first time all night. Good, he muttered. Finally somebody with common sense. But Marcus's expression did not change at all. If anything, his shoulders became even more still. Bennett noticed it immediately. What is it? She asked carefully. Marcus looked toward the doorway where blue lights flickered against the rain. Depends who just stepped out of that vehicle. Heavy footsteps approached the porch. Then a tall man in a command jacket entered the house, carrying Rain across the threshold with him. Captain Harold Monroe. Mid-50s. Broad frame. Silver hair cut close to the scalp. His sharp eyes scanned the scene quickly. Broken door, shaken elderly woman. Officers standing uncertainly around a federal agent's credentials. What the hell happened here? Monroe demanded. Whitaker immediately stepped forward. Captain, we had a verified narcotics lead tied to this address. Then this guy pulls out an FBI badge and starts making accusations about leaks inside the department. Monroe's gaze shifted slowly toward Marcus. For a split second, something unreadable crossed the captain's face. Recognition, maybe. Or concern. Marcus saw it instantly. So did Bennett. Evening, Captain, Marcus said calmly. Monroe straightened slightly. Agent Reed. The room froze again. Whitaker blinked hard. You know him? Monroe ignored the question completely. His eyes remained locked on Marcus while rain hammered softly outside. You should have contacted me directly, the captain said in a lower voice. Marcus gave a faint shake of his head. I stopped trusting direct channels 3 months ago. Bennett's eyes moved between the two men carefully now, piecing together something larger than a mistaken raid. Monroe stepped deeper into the living room, lowering his voice further. You are saying my department has been compromised? Marcus met his stare without hesitation. I am saying somebody inside your department has been feeding locations to a trafficking network operating through East Baltimore shipping yards. Whitaker scoffed immediately. That is insane. But nobody else spoke. Monroe's jaw tightened visibly. Marcus continued quietly. 3 confidential transfers intercepted. 2 witnesses disappeared. 1 undercover source dead before we could move him. Silence swallowed the room. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Bennett looked toward Whitaker slowly, her face pale beneath the harsh overhead lights. Daniel, she asked carefully, who gave you the address tonight? Whitaker hesitated for the first time since entering the house. Just for a second. But Marcus noticed. So did Captain Monroe. Officer Whitaker's face tightened almost imperceptibly when Sergeant Bennett asked where the address had come from. The confidence he had carried into the house began slipping away piece by piece beneath the harsh kitchen light. Outside, rain still rolled across the street in silver sheets while the spinning patrol lights painted the wet pavement blue and red like bruised water. Captain Monroe looked directly at Whitaker now, waiting. The younger officers stayed silent, their earlier energy gone completely. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak into whatever this situation had become. Whitaker cleared his throat. Anonymous narcotics tip came through dispatch around midnight, he said carefully. The warrant was approved fast-track because the address matched an ongoing trafficking map. Marcus Reed leaned against the edge of the hallway wall, arms folded loosely now that his credentials were no longer in question. His voice stayed calm. That map was classified. Whitaker looked back at him immediately. Then maybe your people leaked it. Marcus did not respond right away. He simply watched Whitaker with the kind of patience that made nervous people talk too much. Captain Monroe stepped forward slowly. Daniel, he said, who authorized the raid personally? Whitaker hesitated again. Just long enough. Bennett noticed it immediately. So did Marcus. The old kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Evelyn Reed sat quietly near the table wrapped in a blanket Bennett had found draped over the couch. Her tired eyes moved from one face to another, trying to understand how the men carrying badges had turned from loud certainty into careful whispers in less than 10 minutes. Lieutenant Grayson signed off. Whitaker finally answered. Monroe's jaw tightened visibly. Marcus lowered his eyes for a brief second, as though confirming something he had already suspected. Bennett frowned. Grayson has not been on night authorization in months. Whitaker shifted his weight. He said it was urgent. Captain Monroe slowly removed his gloves, each movement controlled. Lieutenant Grayson is under internal review, he said quietly. The room froze again. One of the younger officers looked genuinely confused now. Sir, nobody told us that. Because nobody outside command was supposed to know, Monroe replied sharply. Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose. And yet somehow he still approved a raid targeting a federal surveillance address. The words landed like concrete. Whitaker's expression hardened defensively. How was I supposed to know this was your place? Marcus looked toward the shattered front door where cold rain blew lightly across the floorboards. You were supposed to verify before sending armed officers into somebody's home. Whitaker scoffed under his breath. Easy for you to say after the fact. Bennett suddenly stepped closer, her voice firmer now. No, Daniel. He is right. Whitaker stared at her in disbelief. Laura, come on. You never even checked federal databases, she continued. You saw a black man tied to a narcotics flag and moved immediately. The accusation hung in the air, uncomfortable because nobody could honestly deny it. Whitaker looked away first. Outside, another vehicle rolled slowly to the curb. This one unmarked. Black SUV. Marcus noticed it instantly through the broken doorway. His posture straightened slightly for the first time all night. Captain Monroe turned toward the street as well, his face draining of color little by little. No, he muttered quietly. The SUV doors opened. Three figures stepped out wearing dark jackets marked with yellow federal lettering across the chest. Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of the younger officers whispered something under his breath. Whitaker's face lost all remaining confidence. Marcus looked at him calmly. I told you earlier this night was going to end badly. Rain dripped steadily from the porch roof as the federal agents approached the house with measured steps. No shouting, no rushing, just quiet authority moving through the storm. Sergeant Bennett looked toward Marcus carefully. Did you call them? Marcus shook his head once. No, Bennett frowned. Then how did they know? Marcus's eyes shifted slowly toward Captain Monroe. That, he said quietly, is the question everybody should start asking. The rain had finally begun to soften by the time the federal agents stepped through the broken doorway, but the cold, damp air still clung to the house like tension that refused to leave. Nobody spoke at first. The three agents moved with quiet precision, dark jackets wet from the storm, their eyes taking in every detail within seconds. The shattered frame. The frightened elderly woman wrapped in a blanket. Local officers standing uncertainly around a man they had stormed moments earlier. Then the tallest federal agent, a gray-haired woman with sharp features and tired eyes, looked directly at Marcus Reed. You all right? She asked. Marcus nodded once. I have had worse mornings. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Evelyn Reed sitting at the kitchen table. Something in her expression softened. Ma'am, she said gently, I am sorry for what happened here tonight. Evelyn gave a small nod, but said nothing. Her hands still trembled lightly around a ceramic mug Bennett had filled with warm tea. Steam curled upward into the dim kitchen light, while the old clock on the wall ticked steadily past 4:40 in the morning. The neighborhood outside had gone strangely quiet now. Most of the flashing patrol lights had been turned off, leaving only the soft glow of wet street lamps reflecting across puddles. Sergeant Bennett stood near the hallway watching the federal agents speak quietly with Captain Monroe. She could not hear every word, but she caught enough. Internal breach. Surveillance leak. Witness compromise. Each phrase tightened something inside her chest. Across the room, Officer Whitaker remained near the doorway with rigid shoulders and folded arms, though the confidence that once filled his voice had disappeared completely. Marcus noticed him staring at the floorboards where rainwater pooled near the broken entrance. You know what the worst part is? Marcus asked quietly. Whitaker looked up reluctantly. Marcus's tone held no anger now. Somehow that made it heavier. You never saw me as a man protecting his mother. Silence answered him. Marcus continued softly. You saw a threat before you saw a person. Bennett lowered her eyes. Even Captain Monroe looked away. The federal agent beside Marcus glanced toward the damaged doorway and exhaled slowly. We can arrange temporary housing for your mother until repairs are done. Evelyn immediately shook her head. No, she whispered. This is my home. Marcus walked over and gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. His movements were careful, patient, almost tender beneath the flickering kitchen light. Nobody is taking you anywhere, Mama. Evelyn looked up at him with tired eyes shining faintly from unshed tears. Your father wore a uniform too, she said quietly. He used to say people become dangerous when they stop seeing each other clearly. Marcus's expression shifted slightly at the mention of his father. On the wall behind him hung an old photograph of a younger man in military dress blues smiling proudly beside a little boy holding an American flag almost too large for his hands. One of the younger officers noticed the picture for the first time and swallowed hard. The house no longer felt like a suspect's address. It felt like a family's life interrupted. Rain tapped softly against the windows now instead of pounding. Somewhere down the street, birds had begun making faint sounds before sunrise. The long, violent energy of the night was fading into something quieter, more uncomfortable. Whitaker finally spoke, his voice rougher than before. I followed procedure. Marcus looked at him calmly. Procedure without humanity becomes destruction. Nobody argued with that. Not anymore. The federal agents continued speaking in low voices near the doorway, while Bennett silently helped gather overturned papers from the living room floor. Captain Monroe stood motionless near the broken entrance, staring out at the wet, empty street, as though trying to understand how one rushed decision had cracked open something much larger beneath his department. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Reed simply stood beside his mother in the quiet little kitchen, exhausted but steady, like a man who had spent his entire life learning how to survive storms other people created. By 5:12 in the morning, the storm had almost completely passed. Rainwater still dripped from the porch roof in slow, steady taps, but the violent wind was gone, leaving the neighborhood wrapped in the cold, blue stillness that comes just before sunrise. Inside the house, the tension had changed shape. Nobody was shouting anymore. Nobody was pretending this had been a routine raid. One of the federal agents stood quietly near the living room window, speaking into a secure phone, while Captain Monroe remained at the kitchen counter with both hands pressed against the edge like a man trying to hold himself upright under invisible weight. Sergeant Bennett finished helping Evelyn Reed gather scattered photographs from the floor. Most had survived untouched except for one cracked frame showing Marcus in military uniform beside his father years earlier. Bennett stared at it briefly before handing it back carefully. "Your son served?" she asked softly. Evelyn nodded once. 8 years. Bennett looked toward Marcus, standing near the hallway. Nobody mentioned that. Evelyn gave a tired smile, without humor. People usually stop listening after they decide what a black man must be. The words settled heavily over the room. Even the younger officers avoided eye contact afterward. Marcus remained silent. He had heard versions of that sentence his entire life. At the front of the house, one of the federal agents suddenly lowered his phone and turned toward Marcus. "We confirmed it," he said. Lieutenant Grayson made direct contact with a burner tied to the Harbor Crew Network 42 minutes before this raid. Captain Monroe slowly closed his eyes. Sergeant Bennett looked stunned. So Grayson fed them the surveillance locations? "Not just locations," the agent replied grimly. "Names, timelines, transfer routes." Whitaker's face drained of color. "No," he muttered. "Grayson would never." Marcus interrupted quietly. "People hide behind badges the same way criminals hide behind masks." The room fell silent again. Monroe rubbed a hand across his face heavily, years of authority suddenly looking exhausted on him. "How long did you suspect him?" Marcus answered without emotion. "Long enough to stop trusting anybody connected to local command." Whitaker stared at him. "Then why stay undercover here?" Marcus looked toward the kitchen where his mother sat wrapped in her blanket watching the sunrise begin bleeding pale gold through the windows. "Because this neighborhood was where shipments kept disappearing before witnesses could testify." Bennett frowned slightly. "You lived here to watch the port routes?" Marcus nodded once. "And because nobody notices a quiet black man taking care of his elderly mother." The honesty in the sentence hit harder than anger ever could. Outside, the first school bus of the morning rolled faintly through distant streets while porch lights began switching off one by one across the block. Neighbors who had watched the raid now watched something else entirely. Federal vehicles, command staff, officers standing uncertainly around the same man they had stormed hours earlier. Whitaker looked down at the soaked floorboards near the broken doorway. His voice came quieter now, smaller somehow. "I really thought we had the right house." Marcus studied him for a long moment before answering. "That is the problem." Whitaker finally looked up. Marcus continued softly. "You believed force first and truth second." Nobody moved. Nobody defended him this time. Sergeant Bennett crossed her arms tightly against the morning chill drifting through the broken entrance. "The body cameras recorded everything," she said carefully. Whitaker swallowed hard. Captain Monroe looked toward him with visible disappointment. "Turn yours over immediately." Whitaker hesitated only a second before unclipping the camera from his vest with trembling fingers. Marcus watched quietly as the officer handed over the device. There was no triumph in his face, no revenge, just exhaustion. The federal agent near the doorway glanced toward Marcus again. "Internal Affairs is already mobilizing." Marcus nodded faintly. "Good." Then he looked around the damaged little house one more time. The overturned drawers, the wet footprints, the shattered door hanging crooked beneath the pale morning light. "Because somebody needs to explain to my mother why her home became a battlefield before breakfast." Sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds just after 6 in the morning, pale and cold at first, spreading across the wet Baltimore street like the night was finally surrendering. The flashing patrol lights had disappeared now. Most of the local officers were gone too, leaving behind only the quiet hum of federal vehicles parked near the curb and the shattered front door hanging crooked against Marcus Reed's small brick house. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rainwater, coffee gone cold, and fresh wood dust from emergency repair crews measuring the damaged entrance. Evelyn Reed had finally fallen asleep in her chair beneath the blanket, exhaustion pulling her into shallow rest while soft jazz played quietly from an old kitchen radio Marcus had turned on to calm the silence. Sergeant Bennett stood near the living room window, watching the neighborhood wake up. A man walked his dog across the street. Somebody opened a corner deli 3 blocks away. Life continued outside as though nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside the house, everything felt changed. Officer Whitaker remained near the hallway, no longer wearing the hard expression he arrived with hours earlier. His vest rested over the back of a dining chair now, and without it he looked less like authority and more like a tired man carrying the weight of a terrible mistake. Marcus stepped out from the kitchen holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one silently to Bennett first. Then after a pause, he offered the second cup to Whitaker. The officer looked genuinely surprised. "You do not have to do that," he said quietly. Marcus leaned against the wall beside the broken doorway. "My father taught me something a long time ago," he replied. "If you let bitterness decide who you become, then the damage spreads." Whitaker stared down at the coffee in his hands, unable to answer immediately. Across the room, Captain Monroe spoke quietly with one of the federal agents before finally approaching Marcus himself. The older captain looked worn down in a way no lack of sleep could explain. "Internal Affairs took Grayson into custody an hour ago," he said carefully. Marcus nodded once. "And the harbor crew? Federal warrants are already moving." Monroe hesitated briefly. "You were right." Marcus gave a faint, tired smile, without satisfaction behind it. "I wish I had not been." Silence settled between them for a moment, while sunlight crept slowly across the hardwood floor. Bennett watched Marcus carefully now, trying to reconcile the calm, thoughtful man standing before her with the image she had walked into earlier that morning. "Why did you stay so calm?" she finally asked. Marcus looked toward his sleeping mother. "Because panic gets black men buried faster than truth gets heard." Nobody spoke after that. The honesty in his voice carried too much history behind it. Whitaker lowered his eyes again. "Agent Reed," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Whitaker continued carefully, struggling through every word. "I came into your house believing the worst before I knew anything about you. I saw suspicion first, not humanity." Marcus did not rescue him from the discomfort. He let the silence breathe. Then he nodded once. "That kind of thinking destroys people long before doors get broken." Whitaker swallowed hard. "I understand that now." Marcus looked around the damaged room again. The overturned drawers had been closed. Family photographs stood upright once more. Morning light warmed the old walls where rain shadows had danced all night. "Good," Marcus said softly, "because somebody else's mother might not survive a night like this." Whitaker's eyes reddened slightly, though he quickly looked away toward the window. Outside, a little girl rode past on a bicycle, splashing through leftover puddles while birds gathered along telephone wires above the quiet street. The violence of assumption had finally passed, leaving behind only truth, regret, and a small house slowly filling with daylight again. By late afternoon, the street looked almost normal again. The federal vehicles were gone. The yellow repair boards around the front doorway had already been replaced with a temporary frame, and sunlight stretched warmly across the quiet Baltimore block, where children now rode scooters between puddles left behind by the storm. Only the fresh wood around the entrance hinted that anything had happened there at all. Inside the house, the air felt calmer too. The scent of brewed coffee drifted softly from the kitchen, while an old soul record played low through the radio Evelyn Reed loved to keep near the window. Marcus stood at the sink washing 2 ceramic mugs as golden evening light reflected across the water. His shoulders looked tired now that the adrenaline of the night had finally faded, but there was peace in the silence around him. Real peace. The kind that returns slowly after surviving something painful. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table folding dish towels carefully with slower hands than before. Every few moments she glanced toward her son, not with fear anymore, but with quiet pride. "Your father used to stand exactly like that," she said softly. Marcus smiled faintly without turning around. "Near the sink. Like a man carrying too much without complaining about it." He lowered his eyes briefly at that. Outside, a car door closed gently. Marcus looked through the window and saw Officer Whitaker standing at the curb alone in plain clothes. No patrol unit, no flashing lights, no authority surrounding him this time. Just a man holding a small paper bag in nervous hands. Marcus dried his hands slowly before stepping toward the door. Whitaker hesitated when Marcus opened it. The evening breeze carried the smell of wet pavement and fresh-cut grass through the repaired entrance. "I know I probably should not be here," Whitaker said quietly. Marcus leaned lightly against the doorway. "Then why are you?" Whitaker looked down at the paper bag before answering. "My mother baked peach cobbler every Sunday when I was growing up," he said awkwardly. "She used to bring food whenever somebody on the block went through a hard time." He lifted the bag slightly. "I stopped by the bakery down on Fayette Street." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. Whitaker entered carefully like a man aware he had not earned comfort inside the house. Evelyn looked up from the kitchen table as he approached. The officer swallowed visibly before speaking. "Mrs. Reed," he said quietly, "I am deeply sorry for what happened to your home." Evelyn studied him for several seconds, old wise eyes seeing straight through the uniform that was no longer there. Finally, she nodded once toward the table. "Set it down before the ice cream melts." Whitaker blinked in surprise. Then a small, broken laugh escaped him, the first honest sound Marcus had heard from him all day. As the three of them sat quietly in the warm kitchen light, the heaviness of the night slowly gave way to something gentler. Not forgiveness all at once. Not erased pain. Just humanity returning little by little where fear and judgment had stood before. Marcus glanced toward the repaired doorway where soft evening sunlight spilled across the floorboards. "You know," he said calmly, "badges do not make people good. Choices do." Whitaker nodded silently. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with ordinary life. A basketball bounced somewhere down the block. Wind moved softly through the trees. The storm was gone now, and in the quiet little house on the corner, beneath warm kitchen light and the fading colors of sunset, justice did not sound like revenge. It sounded like people finally learning to see each other clearly.